Welcome to part 3 of our series, Common Mistakes in Small Business Importing and How to Avoid Them. And today we're going to talk about a mistake that we really see a lot, which is not understanding the full costs of your shipment. A lot of times shippers, importers will feel as though they've been cheated by their freight forwarder because the initial quote that they get doesn't match the final cost that they end up having to pay. The thing is that this is usually caused by not understanding the full cost, not taking some of those costs into account from the outset. So here's some important costs to remember and to take these into account from the beginning. The first is pallet and packaging dimensions. So here's what happens a lot of times. You get your dimensions from your supplier, you communicate those to your freight forwarder, you get a quote based on those dimensions, but then the freight forwarder goes to pick up your goods, and it turns out that they're not exactly the dimensions you measured, right? Because they remeasure them, and suddenly they're taking into account pallet and packaging dimensions that you didn't communicate, and it ends up costing more. So make sure to get those measurements from your supplier and to take those into account from the outset. The next is hazardous goods and certification. Sometimes what happens is that people's goods are classified as hazardous and they don't necessarily realize that, and they end up getting slammed with a fine. So make sure you understand the classification of your goods, make sure you get whatever certification you need so that you don't end up paying these fines. The next is customs fees. Customs fees can be significant at times, so calculate those in advance to the extent that you can, and make sure to factor that in. The final category is charges that come up on the delivery end of things. The first of those is demurrage, which you don't always have control over, but what that means is that your container is delayed being picked up from the port and taken to the warehouse. And the longer that delay, the more you end up paying sort of for your container to sit there at the port, and those charges can really add up. The next is detention. And you often do have control over that. So an example of detention would be if you arranged to have your container delivered to the warehouse, but it turns out that in order to unload your goods, you actually need a forklift, which you didn't realize or didn't communicate to your freight forwarder, and now you have to sort of wait for those arrangements to be made for the warehouse to track down that forklift, and you have to pay for your goods to sort of be sitting there before the container can be returned to the port. And those charges can add up and can really be prevented by understanding what your goods need to be delivered and communicating that to your forwarder. So here's what we talked about today. Make sure to understand all your costs in advance. Really do your research about what's necessary for your goods to get all the way from the supplier to the warehouse, and to communicate all of that to your freight forwarder, and also to understand that unexpected costs can still happen. Make sure to factor in a little bit of cushioning into your freight budget.